Hello and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're watching in the world. Thank you for joining us for the Carbon Energy Fund webinar in partnership with IHEAM and HEFMA. My name is Paul Fenton and I'm the President of IHEAM and Director of Estates and Facilities at East Suffolk and North Essex NHS Foundation Trust. Today's webinar will be presented by Andrew Chatton, Director of Estates at Nottingham University's Hospital NHS Trust, John Gwynn, Project Manager at the Carbon Energy Fund, and Joe Mills, Director of Programmes at Salex Finance. The title of the presentation is Nottingham University's Hospitals NHS Trust, a practical example of progressive decarbonisation. We'll be using the questions function to take questions from the audience, and this can be found at the top right-hand side of your screen and is the icon with a question mark in a speech bubble. We will not have time, unfortunately, to use the audience hands up facility, so please post your questions to the organiser and our speakers. We'll answer as many of those questions as there is time for at the end of the session. Please note that a certificate of attendance will be sent to all of those who watch the live webinar in its entirety. We request that no part of this webinar is reproduced and published in print or any other format. I would now like to hand over to Andrew Chatton. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, many thanks for the opportunity of telling you about our journey towards decarbonisation here at the City Hospital in Nottingham. The impact of the Salex grant investment is a welcome relief for the Trust, the people of Nottingham and our local residents as well, and I'll tell you more about why. I've spent over the last 6 years many hours in meetings with local residents, councillors and MPs angry about soot deposits on the windowsills and cars and the negative effects on respiratory health as an alleged causation from our 50-year-old coal boilers. Similarly, myself and the estates team have supported our clinical frontline teams and patients with steam leakage issues creating environmental conditions ranging from the subtropical through to the Antarctic, let alone the regular heating failures that we have endured. We are very grateful for the Salex grant funding. Next slide, please. So, I'm one of 3 presenters here, as Paul mentioned. I will set the scene, define the need and journey and the specification. John Gwynn of the CAF will explain the solution, and then Joe from Salex will discuss the broader aspects of their decarbonisation agenda. Next slide, please. So if I can start with a little context about NUH. We're a major acute teaching hospital in the East Midlands. We have 16,700 staff across our 3 campuses, over 90 wards and 1,700 beds. We have 324,000 square metre gross internal area. Our budget is just over £1 billion, and we provide healthcare services to 2.5 people directly in Nottinghamshire and specialist and tertiary services to between 3 and 4 million people in surrounding regions. We have a national and international reputation for many of our specialist services, including stroke, renal, neurosciences, cancer services, and also trauma. We're a major trauma centre. Next slide, please. So this slide sets the context of our 3 campuses. The City Hospital is the one we're speaking about today. It's a huge campus site with circa 150 buildings, with 2 main arterial corridors, which we call the North and South, which contain the majority of our inpatients, and these are all serviced by steam. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the implications of the carbon targets upon us. The NUH business case, which we call the City Energy Project, was focused upon the EU emission target reductions for 2030 at 50%. I refer to these as the old emission targets. The graphs demonstrate progression and targeted progression over time. For the City Hospital, we see a 1990 figure of 32,700 tonnes of carbon, falling to 24,950 by 2016. The City Energy Project's target by 2030 is to reduce emissions further to 16,350 tonnes. What isn't shown on the slide is that our City Energy Project will deliver a net reduction of over 14,000 tonnes, taking us to around 10,000 tonnes, which is approximately 6,000 tonnes below the 2030 emissions target. We're aware that the new 2030 to 34 NHS target is to reduce further to a city total of 6,540 tonnes, which is shown on the slide also. This is a very challenging further reduction of 60%, or approximately 10,000 tonnes. We'll be working closely with Vital Energy, our provider, and CAF, amongst others, on our journey towards achieving this. We are also very hopeful that a further tranche of SAILIX grant funding will be available to the NHS in the future to help and enable progression. Next slide, please. So, moving on to the need. The City campus is a mixture of old and new estate. A previous chief exec once referenced this when I first joined the trust, that we have an estate that ranges from the state of the art to the state of the ark, and I'll tell you a bit more about that. The old estate dates back to the early 1900s in parts and has significant problems in terms of primary infrastructure and distribution systems, including steam. Access for maintenance is problematic, and this compounds our problems due to in situ asbestos. Steam leaks to clinical environments cause regular problems, and as previously stated, create microclimates ranging from the tropical to the Antarctic. We only achieve a return of condensate in the region of 60%. The 4 coal house boilers and 2 gas boilers are 50 years old. Due to emission concerns from residents and MPs, we have had to turn off the coal boilers for the last 18 months and rely on 2 gas boilers, which scrape through their last NDT and have regular problems. To cope with this risk, we utilise 2 temporary oil boiler sets, which are costly to run. Next slide, please. This slide shows the proportion of estate reliant upon centralised steam systems for heating. The blue represents the steam and amounts to the vast majority of the site. Our main inpatient wards, and I can't show you by running a line across here, but it's in the centre of the site, and you'll see alignment of blocks served by an internal corridor. Are reliant on the centralised end-of-life boilers and distribution systems, which is a critical risk to us. This risk is compounded by electrical limitations on the system as well, as such that we can't rely on backup electrical heating because obviously we are constrained by the power requirements. Next slide, please. So on to the history and the journey so far. And it has been quite a circuitous route, taking us around 10 years in total to achieve. It started back in 2009 and 10 with market engagement around a solution for an energy centre. In 2012, we engaged with the EcoQuip European Investment Fund. This ultimately faltered for 2 principal reasons. One, the trust went through a change in emphasis and went through an outsourcing programme, a total outsourcing programme. Secondly, because of this, we got timed out in terms of the fund's timescales. Having said that, in 2015-16, we got things back on the track, agreeing to work with CEF to deliver the solution. The procurement process began in 2016, utilising competitive dialogue as a process because this better suited the complexity of the situation and our plan needs. Next slide, please. I think we need to go back one there. There we go. In 2017-18, the full business case was approved by our trust board and was predicated upon private financing and was off balance sheet. NHS EI could not approve this at the time, as there were questions as to whether this was Eurostat compliant, which is a very complex thing, but basically related to the nation's financing and certain conditions that were set in Europe. So we prepared a new FBC based on Eurostat compliance. This involved it being privately financed still, but on balance sheet. This was approved again by our trust board, but was held back by a further Treasury review of private finance in major infrastructure projects. In 2019-20 financial year, the trust was asked to rework the FBC and contract based on a PDC publicly funded model. This was done, approved by our trust board again. The scheme, however, couldn't proceed to get NHS EI approval because we needed the PDC funding to flow for this to be reviewed. We were then asked by NHS EI to apply for SALEX PSDS funding, which we duly did. Grant funding was confirmed in January of 2021, and we planned it so works commenced the day after we received that approval. We have planned programme completion within the 21-22 financial year. What we did learn from that journey was persistence and patience, and that proves to be successful. We got there in the end. Next slide, please. So on to the specification and deliverables. The Trust's 2018 estate strategy was based on the outputs of a transformational change programme called Tomorrow's NUH. This sought investment to achieve a new clinical model. By a mixture of new build and major refurbishment, we will give NUH a new 40-year life. This involves some significant clustering of clinical services at QMC. We call this the QMC maximisation model. As such, the output specification for the City Energy project needed to incorporate a 50% potential reduction in energy requirements by year 7 to 8 of the programme at the City, as we saw services potentially migrating to the QMC. This was a significant flexibility required for bidders to respond to and posed some technical questions. Next slide, please. So, a little about the estate strategy. Some of the critical success factors that we applied to this programme were about protecting recent capital investment, maintaining a 2 sustainable campus site model in the short to medium term, and the options for estate change must be affordable and achievable within the context of the strategic objectives, both of NUH but also of our new ICS. The intention was maximise usage of the QMC campus and reduce migrate services from the City campus, retaining a core at the City. Next slide, please. So this shows an indicative site rationalisation plan. This informed the bidders that zones B and C were the ones that were highly likely to be retained long into the future to enable modelling of demand and capacity calculations over the 15-year period of the contract. Clearly, this was a challenge for our bidders in terms of investment, life cycle, residual values, and cost and value for money calculations. What you can see here is that quadrants B and C are the ones that are to be maintained, and the critical energy centre component you can see in the centre of your screen called SEP. New wards associated with tomorrow's NUH directly adjacent. North Corridor wards to be reconfigured. South Corridor wards to be vacated and ultimately demolished. And that's still in our development plans. So the City Energy project was developed in line with our estate's strategy into the future. Next slide, please. The specification, there's a graph there you can see on your screen. Okay, let's come up. We informed the tender specification, as previously stated, by modelling potential changes in energy demand. Two scenarios of energy reduction were explored. Firstly, a balanced scenario with given a residual demand of 66% of current, and a more aggressive scenario dependent on ultimately the business case future model, which gave a residual demand of 45% of current. You can see the step changes within there, and I'll just go through those now. So by year 8 of our tomorrow's NUH programme, we will have concluded the transformational work to the QMC with a mixture of new build and also refurbishment, enabling a migration of services from the city and a clustering at the QMC, giving a step down in year 8 through to 9 of 82% and 75%, and a further step down as we move more services by year 11 of 66% and 45%. The good news now is that we're formally part of the HIP2 programme with seed funding to prepare our business case for tomorrow's NUH to draw down £1.25 billion investment between 2025 and 2030. Our City Energy project is central to our plans for the future and ensuring that the City Hospital is able to provide the excellent services that we need to continue to provide for our patients. Thank you for listening to me and explaining the definition stages. I'll pass over to John now to talk about the solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Just to formally introduce myself, I'm John Gwynn with the Carbon and Energy Fund, and I'm the project manager for Nottingham University Hospitals. I've been with the project from inception to where we currently stand, and I'm going to attempt to run you through a whistle-stop tour of how we arrived at the final solution for the City Hospital in Nottingham. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. This slide provides a brief overview of our current position. As you can see, the trust were awarded just under £25 million early this year from the public sector decarbonisation scheme. This grant award finally enabled us to progress with the energy performance contract at the City Hospital, which will go ahead and provide significant energy and carbon savings to the Trust of circa £1.8 million and 14,500 tonnes of carbon per year. It will also reduce backlog maintenance and transfer significant risks to the private sector. Next slide, please. I'm going to try to take you to look at where the journey started for CEF, which was the tail end of 2015, when we started discussing the project with the Trust. That then resulted in the Trust signing a membership agreement with SEP at the start of 2016. I'm then going to follow a process all the way through to the current design and installation status, covering the feasibility, shortlisting, the evolution of the solution, and preferred bidder. Next slide, please. This table shows the final procurement timeline, which, as you can see, is across a very long 5-year period. As you can imagine, the original was substantially shorter, with the contract close programmed for February 2018. The timeline started to deviate substantially following preferred bidder status, but it broadly runs through the steps from membership agreement to contract close. I think Andrew's highlighted the reasons for the delay in the process, starting late 17, early 18. So following on from the membership agreement, on next slide, please. Following on from the membership agreement, the next step was to carry out a feasibility study. The main aim of the feasibility study is to understand the site's infrastructure and the trust's requirements, but most importantly, to understand if a project is viable before we take it to market. The feasibility study highlighted the need to replace the aging coal and gas boilers and to upgrade the asbestos-contaminated steam and condensate distribution systems. Here you can see the 3 coal-fired boilers, and this installation is one of the last remaining coal sites in the NHS. Next slide, please. The output of the feasibility study showed that a project would be viable and would consist of partially steaming coupled to CHP, a new relocated energy centre complete with new steam boilers, and further uncosted opportunities were identified as an LED lighting upgrade, a BMS improvement, and a transformer stroke generator upgrade coupled with demand side response. Next slide, please. On completion of the feasibility study, the findings were included in the invitation to mini competition document, which was released to the prospective bidders, and the prospective bidders were then invited to an open day on site. After various presentations from both the Trust and CF, coupled with various tours of plant rooms across the hospital campus, all interested bidders were asked to formulate outline proposals for the project. The bidders were then invited to put forward these proposals in a formal presentation to the Trust. Following the various presentations, a formal evaluation exercise was carried out by the total project team to create the shortlist of bidders. And as you can see, EDF, Intech, Veolia, and Vital Energy were selected as the shortlisted bidders. Next slide, please. All 4 shortlisted bidders were then invited to a series of technical meetings across the period of 3 months. As we described, or Andy described earlier, it was a competitive dialogue process. In these meetings, the bidders were able to explore and test prospective innovative solutions with the Trust and get feedback on those solutions proposals from the Trust. The meetings provided real benefits to both the bidders in receiving that feedback, but also to the Trust in helping them to understand the art of the possible and then to compile and formulate the ITT requirements. Following a series of meetings, the Trust decided on the following minimum technical requirements. That is, the scheme must include at least 5% of on-site generation in the form of renewables. It must include the decommissioning of the existing coal boiler house and build a new relocated energy centre. The solution also had to be fully flexible to meet the needs of the shrinking estate that was previously described. Next slide, please. The specific technical requirements were then included in a series of broader Trust requirements as shown on the slide. the most significant of these being the flexibility to respond to the changing campus footprint, the complete risk transfer throughout the contract term, including design, construction and operation, and to achieve guaranteed energy and carbon savings. And when I say guaranteed savings, I really do mean they have to be guaranteed. Any shortfall from the contracted guaranteed savings figure has to be repaid by the successful contractor to the trust on an annual basis. As such, these really are guaranteed savings. These requirements were then issued to the 4 shortlisted bidders as part of the ITT back in January 2017. Next slide, please. Following the issue of the ITT, the bidders were given 8 weeks to respond with a formal bid document. The tender return date was March 2017. Following which, there was a series of clarifications raised by the trust that had to be answered, and then followed a final evaluation, resulting in a recommendation for preferred bidder to the trust board. That recommendation then had to go through the trust governance process, and then finally, once ratified, preferred bidder status was awarded to Vital Energy in November 2017. Next slide, please. Following the award of preferred bidder status, the hard work of converting the detail in the bid document and the subsequent clarifications by populating the contract schedules commenced and was completed by May 2018. While waiting for the final contract approval, Vital initiated their preliminary surveys and design and commenced with the then G59 application. After going through several rounds of internal and external governance and approvals across several years and stalling for the various reasons highlighted by Andrew previously, we finally had funding approved by Salix in January of this year. At that point in time, both the contract and approvals process were all very well advanced, and as such, we were in a position to be able to sign a contract very quickly, which was completed in February. Next slide, please. Final scope included the demolition of the existing coal-fired boiler house, together with the redundant laundry, the construction of a new energy centre, complete with 2 1.5 megawatt CHPs and 3 new dual-fuelled steam boilers, the upgrade of over 6,500 light fittings to LEDs, the installation of a site-wide metering system, the installation of new high-energy efficiency pumps, an upgrade of the thermal insulation across the site, the installation of 300 kilowatts of solar PV, the installation of 3 heat pumps, the installation of new efficient burners and some of the decentralised boilers across the site, and the provision of ET fans to the hospital's air handling units. In addition, all these, both new and adopted plants and systems, are to be fully maintained and life cycled by the contractor for the duration of the contract period. Next slide, please. This slide shows the buildings to be demolished and includes the redundant laundry, which is highlighted in green on the picture. The removal and demolition of the laundry building will then make way for the building of the new energy centre. Other buildings to be removed on this slide is the gas boiler house chimney, which you can see shown in blue. And then following commission of the new energy centre, the decommissioning and demolition of the old coal boiler house and chimney, which is unfortunately out of this picture, but would be to the top left-hand corner of the picture. Next slide, please. This drawing shows the new energy centre layout, complete with the 3 boilers, the 2 CHPs, and the 2 standby oil tanks, all of which would be located where the old laundry once stood. Next slide, please. This slide shows the proposed boil house image, and I think it probably is self-explanatory. And then the next slide, please. I think I've got the wrong slide there. I don't know if you want to click again. Go, try again. Okay, that's that. Okay, this is quite a busy slide showing the complete site that identifies the various project initiatives. You can see the 2 areas of demolition are shown as dotted lines. The coal boil house is to the far right of the picture, and slightly to the centre, and the laundry is in a fairly central position to the left of the boiler house. The new energy centre and the CHP is shown in dark red and is within the footprint of the laundry. Then there are substantial energy conservation measures across the site. We have the replacement of over 6,500 lamps in the buildings shown in bright blue. The installation of 300 kilowatts of solar PV on the roofs of the buildings shown in purple. The installation of 3 air source heat pumps serving the buildings shown in orange. In addition, then we have the installation upgrade to multiple plant rooms across the site and the installation of metering for both heat and power to all buildings across the campus. Next slide. So the current position is that the final solution is progressing at pace. We're currently progressing on site. Contractors are running around everywhere. There's various surveys and detailed design progressing. The asbestos removal has commenced. The LED lighting installation is ongoing, and the demolition of the redundant laundry is nearing completion. All the main plant items are on order, and the 15 years of guaranteed savings are due to commence in the new year, saving the trust in excess of 1.8 million per year in energy savings and over 14,500 tonnes of carbon dioxide per annum. This scheme certainly answered the trust requirements for flexibility and future-proofing. So thank you all very much. I'd now like to hand you over to Joe Mills, who is the Director of Programmes at Salex Finance. Over to you, Joe.
Hi, I think I'm there now, ready to say hello. So what I'm going to do today, I'm just going to check. I think I should be able to move the slides. Let me just see if I can master this or not. If I struggle, because then I'll just be So I'm sorry to hold you up, but we what happens? No, I'm going to struggle, Gemma. I'm sorry. Could we go back that you'll do the slides? And I'll let you take the screen back to the way that you want it, and then I'll run into the presentation. Okay. I'm going to talk to you about how the role that we can play at Salex. I'm going to tell you. Could we go to the next slide, Gemma, please? Tell you a little bit about who we are as an organisation and how we're supporting the government's decarbonisation targets. In particular, picking up what's been said today in terms of our role in delivering the public sector decarbonisation scheme that I might shorten to PSDS, and the supporting and enabling low carbon skills fund. I'll give a couple of case studies so there's an alternative to see, as well as the Nottingham project, and then talk a little bit about how we expect to see the future. Next slide, please. We are a delivery vehicle for BEIS, the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. We're a non-departmental public body, so we're part of the public sector, and our purpose is to provide funding and export support right across the public sector to enable and inspire actions, as part of that transition towards the low carbon future that we're all working towards. Next slide, please. We were set up in 2004, and until last year, our work was focused very much around providing interest-free loans, and these were repaid from the money saved through the investment. So over that 16 years, we provided £1 billion of interest-free loans, including to a number of NHS trusts, and I'll talk about one of those relationships later. In October last year, the government launched the PSDS, and that's a shift from loan funding to grant funding. So over the last 6 months, we've awarded grants to a value of £1 billion, of which the Nottingham project, 26 million, is one of those. And so the next phase for us is now to support our clients in delivering those projects so that they complete by September this year. The Capital programme was supported by an enabling fund, which was £20 million, the Low Carbon Skills Fund, which was used to support the development of bids to PSDS. And the government sees the PSDS as a longer term programme to really help us on the journey towards net zero carbon. And the second phase of the PSDS was launched with a value of £75 million last month. PSDS is to support energy efficiency and decarbonising projects of public sector estates. And we work across Scotland, Wales and England. We run some loans projects for the Department of Education and also loans for Scotland and for Wales. Within England, our loans programme is now closed to new applications. So the existing loans are continuing, but new ones, we can't do anything since the 1st of April on this programme. Our focus is all on grants. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the PSDS is to fund capital energy efficiency and low carbon heating projects within public sector and non-domestic buildings. The first phase had 3 particular objectives around creating a real step change to the industry. So delivering a real stimulus to the energy efficiency and low carbon heat sectors and support jobs, the creation of new jobs. To deliver significant carbon savings within the public sector and to play a part in supporting the green economic recovery following, well, hopefully we're coming out now of the COVID-19 pandemic, but to see the green economy as a strong part of the economic restabilisation within the country. And there were 3 strands to the Low Carbon Skills Fund. One of those was, the first one was to help the public sector clients, applicants to develop really good projects for which to then submit an application to the PSDS. Also to fund help fund the delivery of successful PSDS projects and to help organisations that were required to produce a heat decarbonisation plan because their PSDS project didn't include heating measures, for them to develop strategic heat decarbonisation plans so that the investment from the PSDS would be very much part of a broader programme. Next slide, please. Both projects, both funds were very heavily oversubscribed. we received applications with a total value of more than twice the funding available for the PSDS, and for the Skills Fund, very similarly, for just the project development support, we received over 1,000 applications with a value of 32.3 million. So that's the first strand. And we were able to fund around half of those projects. And you'll see there that we received 113 applications from NHS trusts and awarded around half of those to develop projects. And that's a pretty good representation of from within the health sector. A lot of those 1,000 applications were received from schools, and there are hundreds of schools. So that we work closely with the NHS and we meet with them regularly. And I know that they really help to promote this programme across the NHS. And there was a very good response that we saw. And then we've been able to fund 48 organisations to help deliver their PSDS projects and fund 74 organisations to produce heat decarbonisation plans. All of this skills funding needed to be spent by the end of March, but we know that BEIS are looking at potentially further skills fund elements in future funding rounds. Next slide, please. So this slide shows that we got a very good spread geographically. You'll see there from where we received applications to the PSDS. So it really is a nationwide programme, and we were able to award grants to 29 trusts with projects with a value of £261 million. So that's around a quarter of the overall fund has been awarded to the NHS. And other bodies include, as I was saying, schools, local authorities, universities and central government departments. So a pretty good outcome, really. So I'm very aware that many people weren't funded, but in terms of what's fair across £1 billion, a fairly good outcome, I think, for NHS trusts in terms of number and value of projects that we've funded. Next slide, please. I'm going to just skip over this really quite quickly because my two colleagues earlier have given a much more full explanation of a description of the project. But what you'll see here is that in the way that we would count things, the projects, the application from Nottingham covered 12 projects. So we quite like to see that kind of whole building approach, a range of projects which will create some really good outcomes, and to make sure that that whole building approach about looking at the fabric as well as the heating, so that when the heating's upgraded, it's not just disappearing out. So it's good to see insulation there as well as lighting, and all the works in terms of solar PV, so sustainable electricity, and the heating measures which are there. Next slide, please. And then just so you can see a little bit about the way that we have a relationship with a client, but also a comparative project. This one just happens to be much the same value, but there were a range of values in terms of applications and grants that we gave. But it's fair to say that the bulk of the NHS ones are large, are towards the upper end, perhaps 5 million to kind of, I think the highest might be 40 million. So quite big capital programmes, well, very big capital programmes within the NHS, recognising the size of your estate. And the Imperial College grant will be spent on Hammersmith and Charing Cross hospitals, part of the framework supported by the Greater London Authority, very significant annual savings, 10 projects there, and again, covering a range of measures around insulation, district heating, heat pumps, and lighting upgrades. Can we move on to the next slide, please? And we've been working with Imperial College NHS Trust since 2009. So we're very open and very pleased always to have people who we haven't got previous relationships with, happy to talk, really pleased to see those applications, but also it's really pleasing to see measures coming forward as a result of this long-term relationship. So over the years, we've provided loan funding to Imperial of almost £12 million. We've been able to award a grant through the PSDS scheme of 26.9 million. And Imperial also made very good use of the skills funding. So they were able to develop their application with an award of around £185,000. And they've received around almost £1 million to produce a heat decarbonisation plan and have their surveyors ready to go and do those assessments and surveys as they were developing that plan. And there's just a quote there from the trust to say about how our relationship and our funding has been very helpful. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there's a little detail here around the loans. So you can see that over those 10 years, we've funded 36 projects. Together, that's created annual savings of £3 million. But the Trust has also made very significant progress towards cutting its carbon emissions. I think it's reduced its carbon emissions by around 24% over that time. And what you can see is some of the way in which the loans have been focused around building management systems and lighting and a range of measures, then culminating in this year's PSDS grant. Next slide, please. So just to sum up, we do really pride ourselves in working with you, and we want to be part of your, if it feels useful, we're very pleased to bring this money to help you improve your estates. The £1 billion has now been allocated, and our focus will be on supporting the delivery of those projects to make sure that the money is spent for the purpose it was awarded and that the outcomes are as strong as we wish. We sent these slides across on Monday, and at that point, phase 2 was still open. But for phase 2, we have applied some learning and some lessons from phase 1. So just wanted to share some of that with you. And one of those lessons was about working with Braze to think, how do we best manage this very high demand for funding? So we agreed for phase 2 that we would close the fund when it was clear that there were sufficient applications to be able to fully allocate the money that we've got. And we also agreed that the fund would not be open to applications. It would be launched ahead of when the applications portal would open. So the funding was announced and was launched, phase 2 was launched about 3 or 4 weeks ago, but the window for applications was opened last week and it was closed yesterday. So this slide was accurate when we sent it on Monday, but as of today it is closed because so quickly we've received sufficient applications which look to be high quality. We are very much hoping that, I'll say a little bit more about phase 2 and then what we look to for the future. It's also worth you knowing that for phase 2, what we were providing was funding very much focused on heat. It recognised, I think, the smaller amount of funding that was available this time. So it was to support moving from fossil fueled systems to sustainable systems, systems that were coming to the end of their useful life. We were providing up to £5 million to each applicant to meet the marginal costs. So the additional costs associated with the sustainable and low carbon energy solution. I'm sure we will learn lessons from this phase as well, and we're hoping that the phase 3 will be a larger fund. Again, there will be learning from phase 1 and phase 2 that will go into that third fund or third phase when it's launched, and there are live conversations taking place about whether the phase 3 will also be supported by something similar to the skills fund to enable the development of projects and perhaps the delivery of projects as well. And we very much hope to be part of supporting that strategic approach and we're aware of the length of time and the commitment that takes place locally before then an application pops up in our portal and in our system. So that's me finished. I'm very happy to take questions, and I'll pass over to Paul, who will be coordinating that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe, Andrew and John, for your presentations. Really interesting project, a live project, and some phenomenal savings there, and carbon savings, 1.8 million over the 15 years, or each year for 15 years, and 14,500 tonnes of carbon saving is outstanding. So the very best of luck with the project as you now progress, and we look forward to its success, as I'm sure it will be. We've had a number of questions that have come in from the audience, so I'll kick off with the first one, which is from Dennis O'Keefe. He says, "Hi Andrew, excellent presentation. Just your experience of competitive dialogue, mindful of OGC's recent green paper on procurement." Dennis has got a lot of experience in dealing with these in Scotland and in Wales via the innovative NPD and MIM models. So just mindful of the technical nature of the project, how important was it to secure the proper time and commitment from the operational and clinical staff, to the extent of maybe backfilling, in order to secure the proper attention and trust input into this critical procurement process? And appreciate your comments, please, Andrew.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think it's very important that we get the right people involved with the right level of engagement. John will have an opinion on that as well, because clearly with CF facilitating all of this, they were very keen that we put the right level of commitment into this. We did that by utilising a large proportion of our environmental managers' time, who in effect acted as a project lead for NUH, with me as the SRO. We also had a dedicated engineering input from a lady called Sue Hickman, who has been through this project right over the last 8-9 years, and therefore was extremely knowledgeable about the solution that was being proposed, the existing infrastructure, the constraints, problems that we have with things like asbestos being in the tracks. Very good engineering perspective of the performance of the existing system, and therefore being able to advise and work with Vital Energy towards the solution we now have and is now unfolding. So I would concur, you know, it's not something we still have to lead on this, even though we're being heavily supported by the other parties. It's important with the informed client.
That's great, thanks Andrew. And just leading on from that, Cliff Howell asks, Andrew, regarding use of the HIP2 seed funding for work rationalisation of your existing estate, was it difficult to gain approval?
To get the seed funding itself?
Yes.
There's a short answer and a longer answer. I'll try and find somewhere in between. It took many years. I've been with the trust about 6.5 years now, and it was very clear here at Nottingham that there wasn't an incremental solution to the problems we face with the 3-campus organisation. So it took a lot of work with estate strategies, with inviting officials such as Simon Corbin to have a walk around our plant rooms and some of our infrastructure, to get to a point that when we made our application, it was well understood in all quarters. And I think it's that preparation up front, understanding, you know, the beyond any doubt, the situation and the solution that's required, that paid dividends to getting that funding.
Okay, thank you. Got a couple of 2 or 3 questions actually around phase 2 funding, which you've now confirmed is closed, Joe. But 3 questions in particular about confirmation of when phase 3 funding will happen.
Sorry, I was muted. I can't give any confirmation. I'm sorry about that. It's being considered within the comprehensive spending review. I think there might, so I think partly it's a comprehensive spending review, many of our successful clients are now are sort of fully committed really to develop these projects. They're large projects. There's a lot of funding gone out to health, to local authority sectors, and across the other sectors as well. So I know that particularly those that weren't successful are going, when can we come back? I think the earliest will be the autumn, might well be a bit later. So, but we honestly don't know. So there's a bit of that, which is a bit of a guess. So we haven't got a time frame. And in terms of amount, we also don't know the amount. But this is the direction that we're heading in. We know that there's a treasure in terms of saying loans are the future. I think it's important to recognise that there's this element of kind of match funding within Strand 2. So I think there are some kind of policy things to just kind of think about in terms of how government funding, or if you like, kind of government funding via SALIX to make that kind of low carbon complements broader measures that are being undertaken within the NHS. And we will keep you posted. So I'm sure as soon as we know, we'll be able to share.
That's great. Thanks, Jo. Just a further question with regards to the time frame. So you talked about the time frame, Andrew and John, with regards to the 5 years that it's taken you guys to get there, and explain some of the delays. But it was just a question that came from Christina Kalija, who says, were the selected suppliers happy to wait for 3 years until the funding was obtained? So question for John and for Andrew, really.
I'll go first. I don't think they were happy. They would far rather have reached contract close in the original indicative time frame. By that point, they've invested an awful lot of time, money and effort into the scheme. And as Andrew's mentioned earlier, it was a case of hang in there, stick with it, and don't give up, which is what they did. And they were prepared to keep going with the trust. There were a few refreshes of prices because of the delay in time. But yeah, I think we all got through it at the end of the day. Not where we wanted to be, but glad that we got there in the end. Andrew, your thoughts?
Yeah, I concur with what you're saying, John. It was a point of frustration for everybody concerned, but we did get through it. I think CEF kept pushing, and that was very much appreciated. Vital Energy, we're very pleased that we selected them as our preferred bidder. I think they showed exemplary commitment throughout, and very proactively tried to stem the tide in terms of inflationary impact, right up until the point where they had to do that because their supply chain was pressuring on them. So I think that was really good. So yeah, all around we're very pleased with the outcome. With these things, as your planning and time goes on, things change, certain coordinates change, and the longer it goes on, the more the coordinates change. So we've got to be mindful of that. But we managed to land it in the end, and we're very grateful for the SALIX funding has given us that opportunity.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Jo, anything to add to that?
I mean, what I think we hope is that we're very much in the hands, aren't we, of our political masters. so we have enjoyed over the loans programme being able to build those kind of strategic relationships where we could make plans for how the funding is spent over a period of time in a way that supports you as you're looking to make major measures come forward. And we would hope, and we're hoping that we'll be able to develop something more like that. There'll still be some bidding rounds, I'm sure, but maybe then some potential to be able to provide some longer term, slightly longer term certainty. So there was very, very tight window in the autumn in terms of applications coming in, and then there's a very tight window for us for kind of completing those projects. And that kind of, some of that kind of speed doesn't relate terribly well then to long-term strategic objectives, except to provide that real step change and kickstart. So once you move beyond the step change phase, my sense would be, and I'm sure our colleagues in BASE are thinking similarly, that looking to something which does perhaps provide slightly more ability to be able to work alongside you to plan. But that we'll have to see what happens.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Got a question from Matt O'Hara who asks, Joe, please can you advise if you have any experiences or advice on delivering decarbonisation schemes on PFI healthcare sites? Will SALEX funding allow for the consequential elongated programs derived from engaging with PFI providers?
Not if we have the fund, if we have the constraints. So it depends on what the guidance is around the programs. So there are very clear rules for us around additionality, and so whatever we provide, whether it was for for strand one, or for phase one or phase two, it is about extra. So there are some very clear criteria about it needs to be extra. But that extra, we were able with phase one, it could go into new buildings if it was going to make a difference to what was specified, or retrofit. So the majority went into retrofit, but some went into new. So in terms of PFI programs, I think if you apply those principles, there's no reason why there couldn't be some of that additionality to allow an improvement. But I don't think anything in phase one or phase two properly not have aligned with that. But that might be something that we take away as a question to just think about how does that fit really, and likewise through sort of NHS and through the sort of PFI routes to have those conversations. So I think if within a PFI contract there's longer term investment, but actually it's struggling to create those shifts in terms of carbon savings, there's no reason why those same principles shouldn't be applied across. But I don't think it fitted well with the phases we've had to date.
And just to sort of thanks. Just to sort of move further on to that, John, from a carbon energy fund point of view, your engagement with PFI stakeholders, can you just talk a little bit about the experience that CEF have had and any sort of difficulties that may have arisen?
I think it's the time frame of, I suppose, multi-organisation arrangements. So you'll have the PFI co, you'll have the trust, you have the contractor, there'll probably be a few different advisors. So the time frame of, I suppose, the SALEX grants does not meet with, I suppose, the day-to-day requirements of a PFI establishment.
Okay, yeah, I think it's an interesting dilemma. We have a PFI on site here, and I have to say it's been a fairly long and arduous process with regards to trying to almost drag them into discussions around some potential energy efficiency schemes that we would like to put in place across our own site. So I think I'm sure others have and will continue to have that difficulty. I'm sure. So a couple of points just back to SALEX, Joe, and I'll try and make this sound as positive as I can. So it's a question that says, will SALEX be able to have appropriate resource to ensure a quick turnaround time on approving funding bids in future grant schemes? I think just an example there that this particular trust waited 2 months for getting sort of approval notification. And the second question, again on SALEX, is from Ian Allen, who says, Joe, it's interesting acknowledgement that investment into building fabric should be considered, but that's not a feature of the recent PSDC funding eligible criteria. So I didn't know if you could just come back on both of those points.
Okay, so let me see if I could get both of those. So I think in terms, I was also just thinking in terms of the PFI. I think there is something to think there about how we work with you on the estates and what you'd want to see within the estates where you've got PFI. So I was just thinking some of the conversations we had with councils around their leisure contracts and leisure centres was similarly really, it's about how that contract's framed the benefit for our funding needs to come back into the public sector. So that's often quite complicated. So I think there are elements to think of, both from within the sort of, if you like, the kind of contract within the PFI, but also from within the trust in terms of and NHS in terms of where the incentives come, as you're saying, really, where the benefits come and who gets benefits and how that works. So moving on to the turnaround, it was the first time, of course, the £1 billion was the first time we'd done it. We recruited a lot of new staff right across the organisation. But you're absolutely right. We were overwhelmed, really, we had an overwhelmingly positive response. And so the objectives we'd set about turning things around within 3 weeks. But we also, so this will help in future, we also committed to learning from taking our loans experience, we committed to work with every applicant to try and help their application reach the desired standard. And that took quite a lot of time, and that's not a feature of the phase 2 grant scheme. So for phase 2, if when the applications come in, there is not adequate supporting material, and this will be less of a feature probably for NHS Trust, but the lessons are still there, we will spend less time coming back and forth. So we're actually doing much more of a screening before we send the application through for the technical assessment. So we're taking very active measures to make sure that we can achieve those turnaround times for the assessments. And if it works for phase 2, I'll be pretty certain that we will adopt that same approach for phase 3. And whilst we're focusing on delivering phase 1, we are very much looking at our systems, and we have a new senior person coming into the organisation to help to look at how we've got systems that really support us. Whereas pretty much everything we did for phase 1 was on the back of our existing systems, because it was quite a quick turnaround to launch the scheme. So I'm hopeful that it will be quicker in the turnarounds for future phases. And the other one, I've forgotten now. What was about longer term? What was the last question? I can't remember now. Sorry, Paul.
So the two questions. Sorry, I didn't know if you've spoken, John. Sorry.
I think building fabric I mentioned.
Yeah, so all the conversations I'm part of, and I think it was there as a feature in phase 1, was around that fabric first. There's also a lot of words on phase 2 around whole building approach and using a lifetime metric. So the understanding and the intent is there. I think principally around phase 2, that we knew that, and they knew that there would be £75 million. Clearly, funding that's being required for other elements of the system is greater than was perhaps anticipated, earlier last year. So the 75 million we knew was a small pot of money, and that's why it's such a narrow focus. That's less, less available really in terms of fabric measures. I think if there was more funding, then I think that a bit more like phase 1, you'd see that opportunity to see a range and the split. But I think, so that we wouldn't be putting in measures if it was if the buildings weren't up to standard. And the focus on phase 2 is around moving from fossil fuel to low carbon measures. So I think it's partly the fact that there's only 75 million, and how do we spend that?
Yeah, I think that probably goes on from another. It's a question, more of a comment from Ian Allen, which is around phase 2 concentrates on alternative heating technologies to replace gas-fired plant, etc. So I think, as you've just confirmed, Joe. Question for Andrew, actually. Well, Andrew and John from Guy Kaiser. Hopefully, I've pronounced that right. Has BIM modelling been used for this project, and if so, he would be interested in hearing how this has helped with delivering a sustainable project and into future monitoring or maintenance. So I don't know who wants to go up first.
I think Andrew.
Andrew?
Yeah, happy to. So, I mean, we've got quite antiquated BIM capabilities at the moment at the city. We are looking as part of the Tomorrow's NUH process at the whole digitalisation agenda and getting a combined BIM system across the 2 campuses that we'll have moving into the future. but I can't definitively say that modelling was specifically used with regards to this project, other than the engagement we had and the modelling we did with Vital and with CEF.
Yeah, and I think I guess it's disappointing in some respects with some of the sort of the lack of take up in some aspects on BIM modelling that we've seen. You would have seen an earlier chair of one of these groups, Jonathan Stewart, who's the chair of FEFMA, who's been heavily involved and has chaired the BIM for Health group for some time. And I think, you know, that has achieved a huge amount of work, but I still think there's whether that's investment, or it's a time, whether it's an understanding, I don't know, but certainly BIM modelling that particularly that I'm extremely supportive of is not being used as I would have anticipated in the majority of the trusts across England. I'm sure there are very good examples where they are, and I'm sure someone's now going to make a comment that I'm mistaken, and that's fine. But I think, you know, the benefits that the BIM modelling brings, I think, you know, rolled into quite a number of projects is astounding, really. So, but okay, couple more questions. Again, from Dennis O'Keefe. Clearly, the emphasis is on technological solutions and the financing of them. But question, Andrew. To what extent has work been concurrently in terms of changing the behaviours of both staff, users and visitors to the various facilities to ensure that benefits are actually achieved? And he quotes, you know, the situation, heating on and lights on during the day with the windows open, as we experience in most trusts that I've been in across the UK. Maybe that's around problems with control, or maybe, as Dennis has quite rightly said, sometimes it's around behavioural sort of aspects. So interesting interesting to hear all three of your views really around this. The cultural behaviours of staff and visitors is an interesting and somewhat challenging aspect to energy consumption and carbon emissions, isn't it? So Andrew, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I mean, at NUH, we've had a sort of a consistent approach to those sort of behavioural issues, but it's a bit of has been historically here, a bit of an uphill battle, because the fabric of some of the buildings, particularly at the city site, is such that you know, we certainly get naturally ventilated. If you look at our windows and you know, the condition of them. The steam leakage problems we've had as well creates a very uneven environment in terms of the amount of temperature control that we actually have. So it's a double-edged sword, really. We're constantly working on trying to sort out the insulation issues. We're constantly working to try and sort out the steam leakage issues, but we are working with our staff regarding those environmental issues about people's behaviours and you know, opening windows on the ward. But there again, you know, you've got a group of patients, some who want to be ventilated, want the ventilation, some who don't. So it's a constant battle. But moving into the future with the hookup between the City Energy project, but also the HIP2 programme, will be in a better position. And then I think it's about people respecting those issues about energy efficiency. But when the condition of the estate is very compromised, as it has been at Nottingham City, it's quite a difficult one to push.
Thanks, Andrew. And John, if I can go to you next.
Yeah, I suppose our framework contractors will probably find it very, very difficult to guarantee savings associated with, I suppose, personnel, activity, trust personnel and visitors. And our contracts are about guaranteeing those savings. So yeah, physical things like BMF and fabric upgrades and insulation and all the other things we talked about today, they can monitor and actually guarantee. Behavioural change is a lot harder from a contractual point of view.
Agreed. And Joe?
Okay, I'm going to be a bit more optimistic, I think. So I'm going to say it's actually, I think it's hugely about linking with comms. I think, and I have huge respect and love working with technical experts, but sometimes those softer skills. So, and I'll then give just an anecdote which perhaps shows some of that example about buildings. So I think it is communicating about, you know, the whole thing from today around kind of like where we're heading. Everyone knows there's a climate change emergency, and the challenge is for us to know how we fit in to help with that. And I think we have that on a personal level. So I think part of the comms is linking to the personal and then sharing that to what's going on. So I worked for 8 years for a local council. We had a BREEAM Excellent building, and we all knew that. Great, BREEAM Excellent. For, I won't get the numbers quite right, but say half that time, we all said terribly difficult to make the heating and everything, terribly difficult to make it work, terribly difficult. Didn't really understand what the passive ventilation, how that all worked. Actually, what was key to that was having somebody that knew how to use it properly, and then communicated through management and through the chief exec and through briefings to staff about how it worked. So we then understood that if we open the windows, it would mess up the passive ventilation and the way the system worked. But that information had not been passed on to people working in the building in any effective way for much of the time since when it opened and the council moved there. So I think, and actually often people are interested to know what's happening. People really care about climate change, and so I think the answer is comms. Not the whole answer, because if you know you've got a pretty old heating system and it pumps out heating and you can't control it locally, of course you'll open windows or close windows, or if the wind, but if you understand the journey and then you understand where the improvements have taken place and how you should use them, that's absolutely key. And I used to work in housing, and we had some really, really great energy efficiency homes that we built. But unless you told the people living in them that it worked, you didn't save money by turning off the heating in the hall, because that just made it all not work properly. You needed to, kind of alter your thermostat overall. If people don't understand, then you won't get the right behaviour. But on the whole, most of us will adapt our behaviour if we understand the rationale behind it. So mine's around comms, and I mean, in the nicest way, just to think, what's the message and what's the long term? Because staff will change. So often we'll say, here's a new project, this is what it is, and we're really pleased, we move on to the next thing. But staff will change, and if they don't understand how to use things, and new staff coming in don't use, they'll move back to the behaviours that they had in their last hospital, or what they think rather than what might be right. And lots of the technology that you're using at Nottingham is really quite new to many of us. So I think all the way through, have a really great strategy for telling people what's happening and what it means.
I think you're absolutely right, and thank you to all three of you for that last point. Really, I think the whole comms issue, the cultural piece, really, really important, and plays a part in this project at Nottingham and a number of others that you've demonstrated, Joe, and I'm sure that John within the Carbon Energy Fund will get engaged upon. I think it's really interesting, and maybe just a final sort of question, maybe a comment from me really. And Andrew, you talked in your slides, if I recall, the sort of the 1900 to 2021 sort of time span of the hospital, and a £406 million backlog maintenance liability. How do you, or how did you get the trust board even around the table to start to talk around an energy scheme ahead of probably a desire to focus on clinical service delivery by knocking old buildings down and replacing, dealing with your backlog maintenance program by filling it with clinical activity? How did you get them on side? What was your thought process and the work that you had to undertake?
So I mean, coming back to the fact that we were one of the the last hospitals in the UK burning a mixture of Chinese and Russian coal. That was something that was well known in the organisation before I arrived here. There was also quite a bit of MP interest in there, and the local resident associations around the city site are very vocal. So there was a significant amount of pressure that obviously led to the trust being very cognizant of that. We also, and one of the first things I did when I was here was link it all together with an overall risk-based approach, which looks at all of the areas around infrastructure where we have deficits, and looked gradually at the number of incidents we were getting where we'd had to introduce business continuity plans. And I think there became a growing recognition and acceptance that this was now no longer just an estates issue. I'm sure many of you out there will have experienced in the past where a problem with your heating or your water or your electrical supply is an estate's problem, but when your infrastructure is so aged, it's not, it's the organisation's problem. And it became more of an exec team effort really to get us to a position where we got the SEP scheme landed, albeit it took longer than we'd have liked, but also we got the HIP2 money as well. And I think it's about accepting the problem we have, and where you haven't got an internal solution to it because you can't generate enough internal capital to turn this around, it's around being together as an exec team to deliver the solution with the available funding sources that exist outside of your organisation. So I hope, does that
Yeah, it does. Yeah, thank you. I mean, as I say, I think it's a dilemma that directors of estates and facilities will have in where to convince your board the best spend of their money is, so to speak, or in this case in dealing with that part of the infrastructure ahead of buying a brand new MRI or sticking some brand new wards in, whatever else. And it's always that fine balance. So thank you.
I might just add, Paul, is that one of the difficulties as a director of estates, I think that we generically have is sort of the 5 case model we have around risk that we use, which is exceptionally good at recording a parity level of risk between different clinical potential outcomes, and it always comes back to, so how many people did you actually kill then by this event happening? Whereas in estates we're pretty good at mending something when it goes wrong, but there's always the risk of that catastrophic thing. And that was one of the biggest fears I had, that we'd lose heating to the city hospital and be unable to have localised electrical solutions. That happened on a low degree day in February would be being very significant.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. So thank you for that. So we've had I've got time for one final question. Guess I was waiting for this one to come in. Thank you in particular to Jane Money, who sent in final question for the day, because we've talked about leaving windows open. So COVID instructions means that comms now is to leave windows open. So the question is, how can we reduce infection spread by extra ventilation and achieve carbon reduction? I'm going to go to John first on this one, and then I'll take a view from Andrew and Joe. John.
Yeah, something to think about. I think we're going to look at technology possibly. More, I suppose, heat exchange units in extract. Maybe throw it open to the marketplace, to the bidders, the contractors, and see what innovation they can bring. But yeah, the extra ventilation is a requirement going forward, and I think it comes down to how you handle their movements and how you recover the heat.
Thanks, John. Joe.
I'm just smiling. So I was pleased to hear this morning about, actually, the Chief Scientific Officer has asked that this be looked at, because it's felt very well, hasn't it, for us on many levels about having windows open. But I've not been to the doctors very often, but but when you go, or the dentist, and the windows are open, and I'm just thinking, actually, we're just keeping our coats on. So I don't have any sensible engineering view, but I do think that maybe we just, I thought people are recognising that we want people to stay safe. And there's going to be some really interesting dialogue, isn't there, about, infection control and what that means for how we dress, what we wear, how we live, and what it means for our process towards climate change. So I really look to our scientific and engineering technical folks to help to kind of, solve this question.
And looking towards our scientific engineering folks, as those directors of estates and facilities on the call will know, actually the first persons they come to is in fact the director of estates. So I'm going to leave the final word to Andrew on this with regards to COVID and nosocomial infections and all this good and righteous stuff around how do we battle the equation of carbon reduction, energy savings, energy reduction, yet here we are leaving the windows open. So over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Paula. I'm glad I got to go third. I'm impressed with the dexterity of thought and the ability of John there not to show through his face that he was thinking on his feet. So I thought that was very impressive. Thanks, John. I think it is all around ventilation requirements in terms of infection control, and I think we've got to join up the engineering side in line with the question that's been asked with that infection control risk, and look at how, certainly in the design of our new hospital build and in terms of the capability of the existing buildings we'll be retaining, how we can sort of live with this infection risk. What I would say, certainly at NUH, we have far too few lobbied areas basically to contain patients with either positive or negative airflow, and on the general wards we do heavily rely on natural ventilation. So it's the balance between the infection control risk and as we talk about, energy management.
It certainly is, and I think that's going to be one of the challenges that we face going forward. So okay, so we're now at the end of the time of this session. So can I just thank Andrew Chatton, John Gwynn and Joe Mills for their presentations this afternoon. I hope those of you that